Savannah, 1839. The city still wore its elegance like a pressed linen collar, live oaks braided with Spanish moss, cobbles that kept the sound of carriage wheels close to the ground, brick facades that looked composed even when the air turned heavy. Rumor moved easily in that warmth, drifting from parlors on Abercorn Street to alleys behind their kitchens. Sometimes it traveled on the page. On April 3rd, the Savannah Morning Republican printed a short line that should have disappeared between shipping timetables and lost and found posts, a marriage license for Mrs. Elizabeth Thornton, widow, 42, and Mr. James Bennett, 26. Nothing more. No lineage, no commentary, no alarm. The paper did not say that James Bennett had been, until recently, listed as property on the Thornton plantation, or that his mother Grace was entered in the household records as a purchase out of Charleston in 1822. A bookmaker's one line concealed a city's earthquake. To understand why that line mattered, you have to step back through Savannah's careful rooms. Elizabeth was born Elizabeth Montgomery, a name that arrived with Oglethorpe and grew wealthy. Along the Savannah River, rice money, old pews at Christ Church, the sort of pedigree that passed down like a silver tea service. At 17, she married Richard Thornton, a widower 28 years her senior, whose cotton fields spread just outside the city. The union stitched two fortunes together so neatly that people mistook the seam for destiny. Richard brought a son, William, only 5 years younger than his new stepmother, and a house that ran with the quiet precision of a well-kept ledger. Grace and her child arrived 4 years later. In the inventory books, the boy was Grace's James, then unusually, James Bennett. A surname in those pages was a deviation, like ink spilled across a column of numbers, noticed, frowned at, marked for later explanation. Other deviations appeared. There were purchases that didn't fit the usual household needs: slates, primers, writing pencils. Someone was learning to read and write, and the initials that appeared beside those entries, J.B., left little doubt who it was. In public, Elizabeth seemed the ideal mistress of a great house, delicate in bearing, exacting in habit, respectful of the order that kept planters' lives smooth. Her cousin Mary recorded a summer visit in 1826 and found nothing to quarrel, with a tidy staff, quiet meals, a husband who spoke little and made his moods felt by silence. But the entries that mattered most were not in Mary's journal. They lived, if anywhere, in the secret space between the ledger with its purchases for J.B. and the small study where the house servant did his sums. A woman of Elizabeth's rank was expected to be a tutor to her own children, not to the child of a woman she had acquired. And yet the boy learned. The boy read. Richard Thornton died in the yellow fever season of 1836, leaving a will that protected his blood, and curiously, one bond he did not want broken. James Bennett, it said, would remain in the employ of his widow and would not be sold or transferred under any circumstances. The clause would become a hinge on which later legal arguments swung. It also served as a clue, quiet but stubborn, that the household order had already shifted. For a year, Elizabeth wore mourning and kept the estate going. People admired the discipline it took. Others would have hired a manager or surrendered decisions to William. She did not. A few neighbors began to notice the edges of her composure lifting. She walked in the gardens more often. She dressed simpler. Her visitors found her changed, easier in some ways, distracted in others. A kitchen maid remembered stepping into the study without knocking and seeing Elizabeth and James too close together for the comfort of custom, the young man's hand falling away as if from flame. A woman across the lane swore the pair moved through the grounds like companions, speaking low, as if the paths themselves might listen. There is a chronology that makes sense on paper. Lesson follows lesson. Boy becomes clerkly. Clerk becomes trusted. Trusted man becomes indispensable. James began keeping accounts, received merchants when Elizabeth was occupied, wrote letters at the desk that had been the master's. He sat where few in his station could sit at all, and always there were books, ledgers everywhere. but also poetry carried from a city shop in plain wrappers. In the evenings, after the lamps were trimmed, the library door was sometimes closed. William arrived unannounced on a winter night, January 15, 1839, and left before dawn to summon the sheriff. What he had seen, he did not fully write, only that the disturbance of natural order left him unable to stay under that roof another hour. Charges were filed and then dismissed. The church suggested a period of reflection for the widow and allowed the matter to fade, as if decorum could put a blanket over a smoldering coal. The coal did not go out. It flared into print. 6 weeks after that night, the notice appeared. Elizabeth had secured papers that recognized James as a free man, and with a Methodist minister who did not fear the word equal, married him inside the house where he had once been property. The witnesses were few. Grace, who had arrived with a 9-year-old and lived to see him sign his name, and a lawyer from Philadelphia whose roots through the North would later suggest that chance had less to do with the marriage than planning did. Savannah's reaction was not contained to parlors. The city council convened to address a moral crisis. William petitioned to declare his stepmother unfit and to take control of the estate. The Montgomery family put their disownment in print, which is the way old names spit without appearing vulgar. Behind the formal moves, the ad hoc committees began, the midnight riders who reason with torches, the private letters that ask governors for help, the whispered promises of men who can make inconvenient papers vanish. 2 days after the council session, they came to the plantation in force. On the first night, the widow met them with a shotgun and a sentence that, for a moment, made rage remember it had a throat. On the second night, they returned with the law and found a house staged for absence. Furniture under sheets, bookshelves, thinned, the little study stripped to a ghost of its former contents. No ledgers with J.B., no primers, no letters at all. Officially, a search began. The largest Chatham County had mounted for 2 people who had left no blood and taken no horse that didn't belong to them. Ports watched their manifests. Roads counted carriages. Notices offered money for eyes that could be sure of what they had seen. Unofficially, other roads opened, the sort not drawn on maps, the sort walked by people who learned to travel quietly long before Savannah called itself a jewel. A sailor thought he remembered them. A clerk in Montreal would later swear a woman with an American accent tried to unlock funds arranged by a Philadelphia friend. The archive of rumor thickened like summer air, but all of that lies ahead. In the chapter that begins with a newspaper line, the city is still standing straight, pretending its rules are heavier than they are. A widow of impeccable pedigree, and a man who learned to write his name in a room where he was not meant to write anything at all, have just crossed from silence into speech. They have done the one thing polite society cannot forgive. They have made their truth public and legal. The morning paper folds. A carriage wheel grinds along Abercorn. In Reynolds Square, someone pauses beneath the oaks, the moss stirring like a hand in the slightest wind, and says the names softly to themselves to be sure they've read them right. Mrs. Elizabeth Thornton, Mr. James Bennett, nothing more, not yet. The day after the notice, Savannah learned how quickly a single sentence could rearrange a city's posture. Parlors that had been open to passing callers went shut. Curtains tilted as if to listen. The polite vocabulary of impropriety hardened into phrases with edges, moral danger, public disorder, a line crossed. The city council convened before noon on April 5th, and the chamber filled with men who preferred their shocks tucked under rugs. They drafted a statement about the structure of our society, as if society were a house that could be braced with enough stern words. Outside on the steps, the crowd was less careful. Tongues ran ahead of facts. Someone swore the minister had been smuggled in after midnight. Someone else claimed Elizabeth had promised money to buy silence. No one asked how the promises of men had bought silence for so long. William filed his petition that afternoon, the paper trembling only once as he signed. In his letter to Judge Henry, he wrote of a disturbance of natural order, a phrase that carried the weight of his father's grave and the terror of a son who believed a house could fall twice. He did not describe the scene he had walked in January. He did not have to. The omission did the work. Inside the Thornton house, a different kind of order held. The sheets had been laundered and drawn over furniture, as if the room itself were taking a breath. Drawers were empty, but not in the way of panic. No half-folded garments, no crumbs of paper to betray haste. The library shelves looked thinned by taste rather than theft. The ledgers everyone would expect to see remained. The novels that could be replaced stayed behind. The poetry was gone. It was the small study off the library that told the truth. There was nothing in it at all. No slate, no copybook, no scrap of handwriting to give away the education that had begun there. The absence felt deliberate, like a hand closing over a candle so the smoke would not rise. The first riders came the night of April 10th, 12 men who believed light belonged in their hands and judgment in their mouths. They circled the porch and demanded a body. The widow stepped out with a shotgun in the crook of her arm and a sentence that belonged in stone. "This is my home and my choice. Leave now or face what comes." Even fury knows when it is being watched by something steadier than itself. The men backed away, their oaths falling short of the steps. Emboldened, Savannah slept badly. By the second night, the riders returned with the sheriff, and the house answered with quiet. No servants, no household clatter. Rooms staged, windows latched, the air faint with the clean resin of oiled wood. In the kitchen, a kettle sat cool on the hob, as if a fire had been doused an hour before a journey. In the pantry, a space had opened where jars of spices once stood, the outlines dust-free, the absence precise. Upstairs, the wardrobe yielded a single dress left behind, black bombazine, morning weight, hung like a shed skin. Weeks earlier, the preparations had begun far from Savannah's porches. In a print shop off Bay Street, a clerk remembered a well-dressed black gentleman ordering cards. James Bennett, importer of fine teas and spices, Rue St. Paul. He asked for embossed script and a clean watermark, the sort of details that persuade a future to behave. In the Bank of Savannah, a quiet woman in mourning changed coin to notes and notes to letters of credit that could travel without clinking. In Charleston, a broker recorded the sale of jewels that had once announced a marriage and would now fund another kind of union. In Philadelphia, a lawyer named Samuel Cooper traced lines north with a careful hand, addresses that opened when knocked in the right way, names that meant safety if spoken softly. Within the house, Grace moved as if she had been rehearsing for years. She bundled what could not be replaced and burned what could betray them. Scraps of exercises, early loops of a hand learning the shape of its own name. "I am James Bennett. I am a man. I have a mind." She watched the letters bloom once more in ash and folded the memory instead. In the small hours, she and Elizabeth arranged clothing with money stitched into hems and cuffs. They filled a tin with needles, thread, a pressed camellia, the pale blossom the two had once argued over in the garden when their hands touched in a way that made time slow and speed at once. Grace packed a second tin no one would think to open. Tea, cinnamon, cloves. The small comforts that make exile taste like a life rather than punishment. James moved between rooms that had once confined him and now yielded like a map he had learned by heart. He checked the locks not to keep men out, but to keep time in. Another hour for the seam to be finished. Another hour for a name to be remembered by a clerk who would say it plainly at a ticket counter. Mrs. E. Smith and Mr. J. Smith, cabin passage, business in Philadelphia. He left the master's desk neat, inktops snug, the ledger closed on a column that reconciled. A house likes to believe itself eternal. The courtesy of order was a goodbye. In town, William's petition gathered signatures, and Judge Henry, recused in public, diligent in private, wrote to the governor to say that decency required a demonstration. Decency is easily confused with fear. The council's edict reached parish pulpits. Christchurch cleared its throat, then stopped short of names. Reverend Baker, the Methodist who had dared a ceremony without a steeple, kept his counsel and folded the marriage into the sacraments of his own conscience. On April 12th, downriver where the smell of tar and salt make a different kind of arithmetic, a schooner rocked against her lines. The manifest listed 2 smiths and a crate of iron fittings. A steward noted a woman with an American grace who spoke little and kept her veil low. and a young man whose deference read as family rather than servitude if you knew how to read it. The river took them as it takes everything, without judgment, down past marsh grass and out toward a wider idea of sky. By the time the sheriff walked through the empty rooms with his hat in his hands, decisions had hardened into facts. The house, offended, held its shape and said nothing. On the library table, someone had left a single pressed camellia between glass, an object too fragile to be a message and too deliberate to be an accident. The sheriff told his men to search the outbuildings. They kicked at thresholds and lifted lids. In the old rice mill, beneath a floorboard that had learned to lie flat over secrets, there was only the echo of lessons, the ghost of chalk dust that had long since settled into wood. Savannah closed its ranks. Posters went up with promises of coin for information shaped like certainty. A dockworker in Charleston swore he saw them. A conductor in Wilmington told a friend he had felt a story climbing aboard his train. A lawyer in Philadelphia ordered more paper. A minister practiced a sermon on the difference between law and right, and chose not to preach it. And in a narrow room on a ship to Philadelphia, two people shared a silence that was not fear, not quite relief, and not yet joy. It was the pause between a vow said out loud and the first breath taken under its shelter. Behind them, the study kept its emptiness like a vow of its own. Ahead of them, a name waited on a box of cards. James Bennett, importer of fine teas and spices. Between those points lay the work of invention, not of fraud, but of life. Threads stitched into hems, routes traced across ledgers. A pressed flower that held the shape of a day when the garden bloomed and somebody, at last, was called by the name he had earned. Philadelphia received them with the clatter of wheels on wet stone and the smell of coal that settles into wool and stays. The city liked its order on paper, minutes, manifests, meeting-house ledgers, and that suited a plan that needed ink to become real. In a narrow office above a Quaker meeting room, Samuel Cooper laid out what he called the roads that were not roads, names to use and names to avoid, streets to walk twice and streets to forget, a seamstress who could stitch banknotes into hems without puckering the fabric, an engraver who would not ask why a gentleman needed cards for a business not yet born. He showed Elizabeth a letter of credit folded to the size of a thumbnail and sealed inside a locket. He showed James the way to sign J. Smith without thinking, then paused before adding Bennett when it was safe. Timing is a kind of proof, he said, and smiled the tired smile of a man who has watched too many proofs fail for lack of patience. At night, in a boarding house that smelled faintly of starch and boiled apples, they practiced their new edges. Elizabeth softened her Savannah vowels until they could pass unnoticed in a northern market. James learned to speak of tea and spice in the language of margin and weight, to name Ceylon and Calcutta as if he had once sweated in their docks. He did not pretend to be what he was not. He practiced sounding like a man whose past was merely private, as the past of respectable men often is. Cooper's ledger, neat, spare, coded by habit and conscience, gave them dates that moved like stepping stones, a small schooner to Wilmington or a packet boat to New York if questions grew too interested, a train whose conductor would look away at the right moment, an address in Albany where a door would open if you asked for the wrong Mr. Parker. He handed Elizabeth a folded list with 2 columns. On the left, what they could afford to lose. On the right, what they could not. Keep the right-hand column small, he said. Carry no more than you are willing to run with. Back in Savannah, the paper war sharpened. William's petition gathered affidavits, neighbors willing to recall, with new clarity, odd hours and closed doors. Judge Henry wrote 2 letters, one official and stiff, another private and shaking at the margins, warning that decency frays when example is set from above. The council ordered watches at the port and posted notices at the custom house. The notices were polite. The men who read them were not. In Christ Church, a sermon urged calm. In back pews, the word calm sounded like surrender. Grace, still in Georgia for appearance's sake, moved through the house that was no longer hers with a purposeful quiet. She answered questions with the exact amount of grief expected of a servant who has lost a household's mistress to scandal and unknown roads. At night, she sat at the edge of her bed and pressed a camellia from the garden, pale, almost luminous after dark, between 2 leaves of an old primer. When the time came, she would carry it north or bury it deep. Secrets, like seeds, can travel either way. On a gray morning in late April, the second part of the plan began. The cards arrived from the engraver, James Bennett, importer of fine teas and spices, letters so crisp they felt like a future cut from metal. Elizabeth traded her morning black for a sober gray that made her look like any other widow intent on business. James wore a modest frock coat, whose fit suggested a careful eye rather than extravagance. At the riverfront, they joined a line of travelers who had perfected the art of being unremarkable. Northbound, the days unspooled in stations and docks that all smelled of iron and damp wood. In Wilmington, a porter called them sir and ma'am, with an evenness that warmed and chilled in the same breath. In Philadelphia again, they slept one last night under Cooper's cautious roof. In the morning, he put a small leather pouch into Elizabeth's hand. 5 years, he said. Enough to make your story true. To James, he gave a sheaf of invoices blank but for the letterhead. Trade is a mask that breathes, he said. Wear it honestly and most men won't look underneath. They crossed into New York by rail, the city opening like a ledger with too many columns. In a tea warehouse by the docks, James learned which crates arrived damp, which merchants shaved weight, which brokers could be trusted not to recognize a man twice if it served everyone's profit. He spoke little, and listened the way he had been taught to read, carefully with attention to the margins. Elizabeth stood in a second-hand bookshop and held a copy of Byron, then set it down with a small smile that meant later. The final passage to Montreal felt less like escape than translation. On the deck, the air turned clean and thin. The river widened and lost its memory of marsh. A child stared openly at the pair and asked her mother if they were married. Of course, the woman said without looking up from her sewing, and the word of course sounded like the first blessing they had received from a stranger. Montreal did not ask them to hurry. It asked for rent on time and the public manners of a small life. The shop on Rue St. Paul was narrow and perfect. A front window that could hold an ordered display of tins, a bell that announced customers in a tone that assumed goodwill, shelves that would accept both tea and the future. James arranged the canisters by region and price, then by fragrance in a sequence that made sense only to him. Elizabeth corrected the sign painter's English with a gentle hand and wrote their names, for the first time in a public place, on a license application without flinching. Back in Georgia, the house that had held them began to revert to timber and paint. William sold it by autumn to a family that preferred its history tidy. The study remained empty for years, as if furniture refused to settle where words had once disobeyed. In a rice mill slated for demolition, a floorboard eventually gave up the memory of chalk dust. The men who found it laughed and wiped their hands on their trousers, and the dust rose once and then was gone. In Montreal, evenings collected themselves around a small table. Accounts, a pot of Assam, a shared pencil. They did not speak of Savannah unless a scent or a word loosened memory's knot. When it did, they let it sit between them until it softened. On Sundays, they sat at the back of a Methodist chapel, where the prayers were short and the hymns resolute. The minister never asked where they had come from. He did not need to. Some faces carry their own mileposts. One night after closing, a man from Boston with trade on his mind asked James where he had learned his business. In the South, James said, and let the sentence end there. And your wife? The man asked, turning toward Elizabeth with the innocent brutality of someone who believes biography is a public right. Elizabeth met his gaze as one meets a draft at a window, steady, unsurprised. Here, she said. We began here. The man nodded, satisfied by geography if not by truth, and left with a half-pound of Darjeeling wrapped in brown paper. When the door closed, Elizabeth's hands trembled and then were still. The next morning they added a new rule to the list Cooper had started. Answer only the question asked. Then they went back to work. Trade is a mask that breathes. Life is the face beneath it, learning how to be seen. Spring folded into the low hot weight of a Georgia summer, and the Thornton house learned the art of pretending. Windows opened and shut at the proper hours. Accounts were balanced by a hired man, who never found what he wasn't paid to seek. In church, heads bowed when they should, and in the market people used the careful past tense. Was, had been, belonged, as if grammar could drain scandal of its pulse. But the quiet was a costume. Behind it, Grace moved like a keeper of clocks. She knew which boards in the study sighed when stepped on. She knew which drawers had once held slates and which had held folded letters addressed to no one and everyone. The night before she left the plantation for the last time, she wrapped something small in oilcloth, a notebook's weight, a secret's temperature, and slid it under a pried-up plank, easing the wood back with the heel of her hand until the seam disappeared. Her palm smelled faintly of ink long after the candle was blown out. If the house had a heart, it beat there. By day, she performed the gestures expected of a woman whose people had been scattered by sale notices and new masters with colder eyes. She answered questions in the measured tone that soothed suspicion without inviting more. "No, miss," to the ladies who came to sniff at ruin. "Yes, sir," to the men who asked if Mrs. Thornton had written. When William appeared on the veranda with the lawyer who would help him unspool his stepmother from her own estate, Grace poured them tea with a hand as steady as a ledger line. The young master, older than Elizabeth by 5 years and younger by a century of experience, studied her face the way men study maps when the road has already been chosen. If he hoped to read mercy there, he misread the language. Grace had learned to keep silence fluent. At night, she wrote. The words were careful, round with practice, addressed to Mrs. Jane Bennett at a northern boarding house whose landlord knew how to hold mail without holding tongues. Our mutual friend asks after you often, she penned with a steadying breath. The new master has made the fields a harsher place. The thing you asked me to guard is where we agreed. It will not move without my hand. She folded each sheet with the domestic tenderness of tucking in a child and passed the letters into palms that knew the road north by touch. Kitchen hands, steeple hands, hands that hefted crates on the docks and never forgot a face they were paid to forget. When the time came, Grace stepped onto a wagon seat beside a woman who sold eggs at market and secrets by agreement. They traveled by dawn and dusk, resting in the hour when the light is too honest for travelers inclined to lie. Savannah narrowed behind them into a rumor. The marsh's breath thinned to pine. In Charleston, she changed her name to one on a small card an abolitionist printer had set in clean type for just such crossings. In Wilmington, she was simply G, soft enough to slide across a countertop. In Philadelphia, a Quaker woman pressed Grace's fingers between her own and said only, rest, which is the richest word some women ever hear. North of the lines on men's maps, Montreal carried itself like a room with many doors. Tea crates thumped onto Rue St. Paul. Horses snorted clouds into winter air. French and English braided in the market, until meaning was a rope you could climb, if you weren't proud about which hand you used. The Bennett shop breathed in a small, regular way. Bell, greeting, tin lid hiss. The clean weight of paper around leaves that smelled like far places. James found the rhythm that work gives a body deprived of it too long. He wrote invoices in a hand that had once trembled, and now did not. Elizabeth learned the names of small necessities in French, wrote Madame Bennett on a slip for the license, and folded it into a drawer without touching it for 3 days. Their evenings were a study in unremarkable grace. The narrow table with ledgers and a lamp, the teapot that steamed more evenly on the second boil, the soft clatter of the shop's bell after closing, when a late customer apologized, and still bought a £1/4. On Sundays, they sat in the last pew of a Methodist chapel that asked no questions and sang hymns that sounded like floorboards holding. When conversation turned, as it sometimes must, to what had been left, they let memory walk a little way, then called it back. Survival needs short leashes. Grace arrived in a rain that freshened everything it couldn't chill. The bell rang and rang again because the door thought habit meant 2 people, not 3. Elizabeth's first word was not a word so much as the sound a throat makes when it sets a burden down. James, who had been taught to hold still in joy so it wouldn't notice him and move on, didn't move at all. He took Grace's small bundle, set it on the counter, and reached for her hands as if they were oars and he had just learned there was a shore. They made a room for her at the back of the shop, narrow, tidy, a window that caught 3 hours of good light even on stingy days. Grace hung her dress on a peg and her secrets in the space between pegs. At night, she sat with Elizabeth to stitch thin wealth into hems, practiced new coin in a new country, and learned how to flavor stew with fennel because it was what the vegetable seller had that week. She kept the pressed camellia between 2 leaves of the primer, and on the worst nights she opened the book just enough to see pale petals hold their shape against the dark. News from Savannah traveled in contradictions. The estate was sold in October. Then it wasn't. Then it was, but to Virginians who preferred money that did not talk back. Judge Henry recused and then advised, the way men do when they want to both wash their hands and be thanked for the water. A letter reached them, forwarded twice, thumbed by 3 strangers, the seal tired. In it, a young clerk wrote that Judge Henry had read a certain document, all in one sitting, shut the drawer of his desk with a gentleness that made the clerk afraid, and died 3 weeks later of a word doctors use when the cause is a feeling they are not paid to name. The clerk copied a passage, 4 sentences no more, into his private notebook before the widow took the document to the fire. Years later, he would show those sentences to a man from Harvard who collected fragments with the faith of a monk. For now, the copied words slept inside a cheap leather binding on a shelf that also held a catechism and a broken seal. Work grew. Porters learned the Bennett shop paid on time and used a fair scale. The directory added importer under James's name, with the small civic pride of a city that believes in listings. A young woman named Marie LeBlanc came to help, and wrote in her diary that Madame spoke French with an American lilt and policed dust with the rigor of a teacher. She noted that Monsieur arranged tins as if they were a poem with stanzas, that the 2 shared glances like people who had learned to speak in rooms never meant for talking. Winter pressed its face against the glass and fogged it. Spring returned with wet boots and better moods. In the soft months between, Elizabeth folded her hand over her middle and paused in the doorway to the back room. She did not speak. She did not need to. Grace set a cup of ginger tea on the counter and said, "All journeys should lead somewhere," which is as close as some women ever come to blessing themselves aloud. Back south, a workman pried up a plank in the small study to run a new wire, and found nothing, because secrets in old houses do not answer to schedules. He replaced the board and left a smear of hand oil, where a woman's palm had once pressed the wood flat, for an entirely different reason. The house settled again into the posture of something waiting to be torn down. Fields grew under other hands. Names went off to other ledgers. Savannah practiced forgetting with the skill of a city that must in Montreal. The Bennetts practiced remembering without breaking. Each day acquired its faithful parts. The key turned. The bell spoke. Trade's mask breathed. Faces beneath it learned slowly to be seen. And at night, when the lamp threw a circle just big enough for 3, Grace would take out the primer and open it to the pressed flower. The petals, though years removed from Georgia, kept their pale courage. James would touch the glass and feel that courage travel through to his skin, the way warmth does when you set your hands near a stove you can't see. Not yet, Elizabeth would say when hope tried to rush ahead of them, and Grace, who knew how to keep a key and a promise and a pace, would nod. Not yet, she would answer, but soon enough. Summer came early that year, carrying heat up the St. Lawrence as if the river had decided to remember Georgia for them. Trade was steady, enough small sales to keep the ledger honest, enough larger orders to make the future feel less like a story Cooper had told and more like something they had entered. In the mornings, James chalked prices on the board with a hand that no longer hesitated. In the afternoons, Elizabeth kept the counter while Grace measured out cloves and ginger, a steady pulse of work that calmed the hours. By late July, the bell above the door startled Elizabeth in a new way. She would lift a hand to her middle without thinking. "Sit," Grace would say, making a seat from a crate turned on its side, and Elizabeth would sit, laughing at herself, and then falling silent, as if listening for an answer from inside. They did not speak the hope aloud in the shop. At home, after the lamps were turned down, they let themselves say it plainly. A child, if the world allowed it. When the pain came, it came the way truth does, refusing to wait for the perfect hour. Rain crowded the eaves. The streets were nearly empty. Grace closed the shop without apology, hung the ferme sign as if it were any other day, and set water to boil. The midwife from 3 doors over arrived with a bag that had seen more kitchens, then parlors, and a voice that made instructions sound like blessings. James stood where he was told and did what he was told, and learned that fear can live alongside awe without either winning. Near dawn, when the rain settled into a tamped murmur, a cry as thin and fierce as a reed in wind filled the room. They named her Grace. No middle name, no compromise. The old name and the new life in one breath. In the shop ledger that morning, James wrote a single extra line beneath the column of sales. G. Bennett arrived before sunrise. All accounts changed. He closed the book and went to brew tea strong enough for 3 generations. Word found its way down Rue St. Paul. Customers came with small presents that made a household richer. A pie still warm, a blanket knitted in a pattern that looked like a river seen from a bridge, a wooden rattle with a bell that made even Marie, the shopgirl, smile in a way her neat diary hand never admitted. The minister from the Methodist chapel stopped in on his way to a visit and placed his palm, lightly, on the tiny brow. "May your path be broad where it needs to be, and narrow where it must," he said, and left with a half-pound of Assam and the shop bell's careful thanks. With the child came a new set of calculations. The routes James had learned for safety became routes for errands and naps. The park with the bench that caught the best morning light, the back pew where the draft did not reach, the midwife's alley where the stones were smoother for a pram. Elizabeth's joy moved with intent. She held the baby the way she had once held plans, certain and gentle. At night she read lines from Byron in a low voice, the familiar cadences turning from defiance to lullaby. "We are not hiding," she said once, surprising herself. "We are living." James kissed the child's hair and answered, "Both. Not everyone who crossed the threshold came for tea." One afternoon, a man from Savannah stepped into the shop with the look of someone who believes distance makes him bold. His hat was too new for travel. His gaze caught and held too long. He turned the tin labels with one finger, then the conversation toward origins with the same idle pressure. "Fine business you have here," he said to James. "Wouldn't have imagined it, given background." He left the last word open like a trap. James set a wrapped parcel on the counter and chose the rule they had written. Answer only the question asked. "Thank you," he said. "Will that be all?" The man smiled the way men smile when they are about to say something they think is clever and cruel at once. Before he could, Grace, older, smaller, exact, stepped from the back room and lifted her granddaughter to her shoulder. The child regarded the customer with the native patience of the newly arrived. Whatever remark the man had been composing died under the weight of that simple fact. He paid and left with a nod that tried to be superior and landed somewhere short of human. After he'd gone, they added another rule to the paper in the drawer. When in doubt, let the baby answer. It made them laugh, which is another kind of safety. Trade thickened. By 45, they took the larger premises 2 doors down. A wider window, deeper shelves, a back room that could hold a crib and a desk without either apologizing to the other. The city directory advanced James from shopkeeper to importer, a small word with long consequences. Teens multiplied. So did accounts that carried balances into next month with the comfortable promise of settlement. Marie's diary, faithful, tidy, marked the change. Madame's French improves. Monsieur's handwriting grows more sure. The child laughs at the shop bell. I think God approves of this sound. News drifted north, stitched to other news. The year 1849 brought stories of fever in the ports, of a winter that would not end, of a law to the south that made even free streets dangerous for some. In Montreal, the air sharpened but did not cut. People spoke of American politics the way they spoke of weather elsewhere. Interesting, changeable, far. Still, the visits from Boston merchants carried a new attentiveness, the kind born of curiosity that thinks it is innocent. Once, at closing, a man lingered too long, asking about suppliers, about history, about the shop's first month. James answered gently, and then walked him to the door and held it open the way men do when courtesy is also a line. That winter, coughs settled in the city's chest. James worked through his, then didn't. The doctor called it a chill. The minister called it a season. Elizabeth called it by its name only once, alone, and then returned to broths and blankets and the measured calm of the watchful. Grace kept the shop's front, while Marie managed the books with a concentration that made her seem older. For weeks the house moved in low voices in the rhythms of care. On a gray afternoon when the light felt used up by noon, the fever broke and did not return. James slept like a man forgiven. In spring, with strength returning and the child walking with the gravity of the newly mobile, they took stock. The shop was sound, their faces were known. The questions from travelers were the only part of the life that still felt thin. "Quieter," Elizabeth said, looking out at the street. "A little further from the docks." St. Henry offered both, close enough for deliveries, removed enough to be a life. They sold the first shop to a French-Canadian trader who shook James's hand as an equal and argued the price with pleasure. The new place had a small yard that caught afternoon sun, and a room just large enough for a desk beside a cradle. On the day they carried the last crate out, Elizabeth stood in the doorway a moment longer than the others. She set her palm flat, against the jamb the way she had once pressed a floorboard in Savannah, and felt wood answer with its old, steady indifference. "Thank you," she said to the empty room, to the bell, to the ledger lines that had guided their hands. She pulled the door shut and did not look back. In St. Henry, the neighbors said hello without sorting the hello by history first. The minister remembered the child's name without prompts. The shop hours shortened by 1 hour on Thursdays, so they could walk to the river and let Grace throw crumbs to birds with the solemn joy of a woman who has learned to like the world again by inches. At night, after accounts and tea and a single line of verse, James would lift his daughter and show her the moon through the window, naming it in English and then in French. The child tried both names on her tongue and kept the one that felt like play. Once a week, Elizabeth took out the small pouch Cooper had given her years ago and counted notes, receipts, a narrow paper that unlocked help if help was ever needed again. She put it away each time with a hand that had learned not to tremble. Across the table, James copied an address into 3 places: the license, the directory form, the corner of a card he would hand to merchants who liked paper proofs. Each time he wrote the surname, it felt less like daring and more like exactly what it was. They did not call what they had peace. Peace sounded finished. They called it enough, and most days it was. On the wall above the desk, the primer hung open in a shallow frame to the page with the pressed camellia. The flower kept its shape stubbornly. Some afternoons the child pointed and asked, "What's that?" "Home," Elizabeth would answer. And then, when the girl frowned at the contradictions of maps and memory, add, "One of them." In Savannah, the old house went to a family who liked new paint and old stories as long as the edges were sanded down. In a study that had once taught a boy his name, a new desk sat without complaint. Under the floor, where a different kind of ledger had been hidden and later found and lost again, wood kept its counsel. Cities learn forgetting. Houses sometimes do not. On a Sunday in late summer, the minister read a line about things hidden brought to light, and the child, 3 now, precise in her questions, whispered, "Like the flower?" Elizabeth nodded. James closed his eyes for a moment and let the words settle where fear had once lived. Grace kept the pew end straight as a plumb line and held the girl's hand. When the hymn came, they sang, low, steady, without flourish. It sounded to the 4 of them like a key turning in a lock that had once refused them and now finally learned their touch. The first frost in St. Henry came clean and early, a thin film on barrels and steps that made the street look carefully underlined. Trade slowed to the measured beat of cold weather. Coal first, tea second, spices when a household could afford cheer. They shortened the shop hours by a lampwick's width and learned how to keep a room warm without giving the neighbors reason to wonder what they were burning. James's cough returned in November, the sort of cough that pretends to be a habit before it shows its weight. He worked as men do when work has been the one reliable map, opening the shutters, measuring out a psalm, making a joke for the boy who ran messages in exchange for sweet biscuits. At night, when the house settled into its small chorus, child's breath, kettle's quiet, the scratch of a pen, His breathing went ragged at the edges. "A chill," the doctor said, as if naming could tame it. "Soup, rest." They did both. Snow found them in December and stayed. On a morning when the glass had filmed milky with cold, he opened the shop and the bell announced a customer who didn't come. It was only the door learning how winter works. Grace steeped ginger until the whole house smelled sharp and alive. Elizabeth counted the child's pulses against her own. The old instinct of a woman who had once kept a plan's heart beating, now turned toward a smaller, fiercer life. The fever took its time deciding. It rose and fell, as if calculating what the household could bear. In the second week of January 1849, it made its choice. The minister set his hat on the table without fuss and sat by the bed with the kind of presence that believes in silence. Grace kept vigil the way she had kept accounts hidden, exact, patient, unwilling to miss a line. Near midnight, the house changed temperature, a subtle shift the old know to listen for. James's breath eased into a rhythm that belonged to no season. He looked at Elizabeth as a man looks at the one person who has witnessed him into being, and managed a small, astonished smile at having been allowed so much. When he rested his eyes, the line did not rise again. They made the room ready the way their people always had. Water, light, a clean sheet, a prayer spoken like work, steady and honest. In the morning, snow fell soundless enough to seem kind. Elizabeth wrote a single line at the bottom of the day's ledger and closed the book. Accounts to be settled in another hand. Montreal recognized widowhood with practicalities. The license shifted from 2 names to 1. The directory printed Mrs. Jane Bennett, shopkeeper, St. Henry, as if the city had always planned to write her that way. Neighbors brought food in quiet bowls. The minister came with a text about light in dark places, and, uncharacteristically, did not read it. He sat with the child and let her ring the small brass bell he carried, the clear sound stitching the room back together, stitch by stitch. Grief reorganizes a house. The crib moved closer to the desk. The ledger migrated to the kitchen table where soup could advise arithmetic. Grace reopened the shop 3 days later, because the world has to be kept exact, even when it cannot be kept whole. Elizabeth learned how to answer questions that pretended to be condolences. "Yes, thank you. Yes, we are well enough. Yes, the tea is fresh." On Sundays, she took the back pew alone and discovered that singing is a way of standing, when standing is difficult. Spring offered small proofs, the child's hand heavier in hers. The first day, the door could be left propped open without daring the wind. The gossip of sparrows thick in the yard. Work returned its discipline. A French-Canadian trader tried to buy the shop outright. Elizabeth refused with a courtesy that would have made Savannah proud. She stacked new tins, learned which invoices to press and which to release, and taught the girl to count by laying beans in neat rows. At night, she read Byron in a voice that found new meanings. Defiance, yes, but also survival, in a register that no longer had to be loud. In 1852, a stranger came asking after tea, then for more than tea. He introduced himself as Thomas Wilberforce, and carried himself like a clerk who had learned to make his carefulness a shield. He was polite and exact, his Boston consonants folded crisply into his English. He bought a pound of Darjeeling and asked, as casually as men who practice are able, whether Madame Bennett had ever visited Savannah. "I've visited many places," she said, which was both true and sufficient. He nodded, received the parcel, and turned to go. At the door, he hesitated, then spoke as if something had been left on a table and needed to be reclaimed. "Forgive me," he said, "but I once knew a household where Byron was read with uncommon attention to commas." Elizabeth smiled with the sort of gentleness that can end conversations without wounding them. "The commas are where the courage hides," she answered. He studied her face a fraction of a second longer than good manners permitted, then bowed. "Indeed," he said, and left with his tea and his restraint intact. The next week he returned and did not ask any more history disguised as curiosity. He purchased Ceylon and a small tin of cloves for a neighbor. He mentioned an interest in old papers and the quiet networks that move people north. Elizabeth wrapped his parcels tightly enough to make him feel trusted, and said nothing about networks. As he reached for the door, his gaze lifted to the framed primer. A camellia, he said softly, identifying the pressed blossom by memory rather than botany. Rare this far north? We keep what keeps us, Elizabeth replied. He said nothing more. Some stories do not require confirmation when both listeners are fluent in omission. Legalities adjusted to reality. In late summer, the deed to their small house recorded a transfer to Mrs. Jane Bennett, widow, a line of text that sat there without drama and yet closed a circle years in the drawing. The shop's accounts listed a new supplier, a man who did not care that his Montreal importer was a woman, as long as she paid on time. The Methodist register entered a note so brief a reader might miss its weight. Grace B., age 6, instruction steady, attendance regular. The child grew into her name with the seriousness of the very young. She learned to greet in 2 languages, and to keep certain questions for home. Once, while helping to dust, she asked why their family had 2 flowers, and only one was framed. Because some things can be shown, Elizabeth said, and some must be carried. The girl considered this, nodded as if given a rule of arithmetic, and returned to the tins, polishing the bright letters that spelled out distant places she would one day be allowed to visit. That winter, a letter came from Philadelphia. Thin paper, tidy hand, no signature. Accounts balanced. The northern door remains. If ever closed, ask at the meeting house and give your name as Smith. You will be remembered. Elizabeth folded the page and placed it in the pouch Cooper had once put in her keeping. The leather had softened with years of being opened for reassurance and closed again for strength. On an April afternoon, Wilberforce visited a last time. He did not speak of Savannah. He asked instead if the shop carried a particular blend a Harvard man favored. We do, Elizabeth said and measured it out, the scale's arm finding evenness with practiced ease. As she wrapped the paper, he gestured to the small portrait on the wall, a formal likeness painted by a local hand. James in his best coat, eyes steady, mouth at the edge of a smile. Your late husband? He asked without emphasis. Yes, she said. He passed 3 years ago. Wilberforce bowed his head, not in grief exactly, but in recognition of facts set properly at last. Then I wish you continued prosperity, Madam Bennett, he said, and left into a city that had learned to ask fewer questions than the one they fled. After he was gone, Elizabeth stood a long moment before the portrait. She did not weep. The years had taught her another grammar, how to conjugate love into work, memory into bread, fear into rule, and rule into habit. She lifted the child, now long-limbed and curious, and the girl laid her palm against the painted coat as if testing the fabric. Baba, she said in the private language children make for what they lose too early. Yes, Elizabeth answered. Always. Spring loosened winter's grip from the eaves, and the shop bell regained its cheerful clarity. The ledger lines steadied. The camellia kept its pale defiance behind glass. On Sundays, the hymn about hidden things brought to light sounded less like threat and more like promise. They did not call it safety. They called it enough, and most days it was. Far to the south, boards shifted in an old study and hid what they had been asked to hide a little longer. In years to come, men would pry and find either too much or not enough. But in St. Henry, in the small rooms where tea scented the air and a child practiced her letters under a watchful hand, the present held. Names were spoken plainly. Work was honest. The door opened, the bell chimed, and life, deliberate, lawful, and chosen, went on. Years lean in quietly when a house is well kept. St. Henry learned their rhythms, shutters opened to honest light, a bell that chimed like a small promise, evenings counted in cups rather than in fear. The child Grace grew from solemn watcher to quick-browed apprentice, the sort who asked why cloves were priced dearer than cinnamon, and accepted because distance has its own cost as a complete answer. On Sundays, the minister noted her steadiness in the register, instruction regular, attention good, a thin line that, to Elizabeth, felt thicker than any inheritance once promised in Savannah. The rules in the drawer remained, amended by living rather than by danger. Answer only the question asked. Trade is a mask that breathes. Keep the right-hand column small. When in doubt, let the child answer. Show what can be shown. Carry what must be carried. They did not read the rules aloud anymore. Habit had made them fluent. Grace the Elder aged into a precision that looked like ease. She could tell a shipment's honesty by the sound a crate made when set down, could soothe a child's fever with ginger and patience, could fold a letter so that it did not look like a letter at all. In winter she wore shawls that remembered Georgia without insisting on it. At night, when the household stilled, she lifted the primer and checked the pressed camellia, as if counting petals were a prayer that kept all three of them on the right side of the ledger. In 1860, when the girl, 14 now, sharp as fresh ink, stood to be confirmed, the minister asked her to state her name. "Grace Bennett," she said, voice steady. The sound of it landed in Elizabeth like a key turning. Later at home, they marked the day in their own fashion. The old Byron opened. One stanza read not for rebellion now, but for the way a line can hold when everything else shifts. The girl, who understood more than adults guessed, traced the italics with a fingertip and said, "Some words are stronger than paper." No one corrected her. Trade held. Tea moved in its faithful seasons. Spices taught neighbors to risk small extravagances. The shop's care, like most honest works, passed quietly to younger hands. Marie married a carter and visited with news and bread. The French-Canadian who had once tried to buy them out tipped his hat each spring and brought early berries for the child who was no longer a child. Elizabeth learned to stop checking the door at every footfall from the street. Some days she forgot Savannah until a scent, wet magnolia in a Montreal rain, carried it in like a memory with its own key. The city's records did their small, reliable work. In 1867, a clerk with tidy habits entered a transfer, the St. Henry house to Miss Grace Bennett, niece. It was the sort of line people skim in ledgers and remember in kitchens. Elizabeth signed with a hand unshaken by the notion of property in the care of a girl who had, from the start, belonged to no one but herself. That night they celebrated in the way their rules permitted. A stronger tea. The shop closed an hour early. A walk to the river where the wind unknotted the day. Letters still arrived from the network that preferred grace to glory. Most were brief to the point of vanishing. Route safe, a name to trust. News that a door in Philadelphia would continue to open if asked for under an old arrangement. Elizabeth filed them in the leather pouch whose seams she had mended twice. She no longer needed to touch the papers to feel reassured. Keeping them had become its own oath. Time, even for careful households, asks for its due. Grace the Elder's steps shortened. Her shawls grew heavier. On a mild evening, she sat with the younger Grace at the threshold and taught the girl the last thing she had to pass on: how to hear the shop bell even when you are in the yard, how to know by its pitch whether a stranger stood there or a neighbor. "Listen twice," she said, "then answer." She slept easily that night and did not wake. They dressed her as she would have approved, clean, exact, unburdened by show, and carried her name forward the way they had always carried their secrets, plainly and without apology. 2 years later, in the spring of 1869, Montreal printed the shortest of truths. Mrs. Jane Bennett, formerly of the United States, aged 72, deceased, survived by her beloved granddaughter, remembered for quiet strength, a love of poetry, and a belief that all souls are equal before God. The obituary said nothing of rice fields or primers or a study emptied to save a life. It did not need to. Those details had been written elsewhere, on tin labels set straight, on a child's tongue learning words in 2 languages, in the soft rule of a house that refused to spend its days on fear. They laid Elizabeth in the small St. Henry Cemetery beside a stone that bore only the years 1822, 1849, a marker whose restraint said more than chisel work could hold. "Home," the younger Grace whispered, meaning both and neither. St. Henry changed as towns do, streets straightened, windows widened, names shuffled to make room. The shop learned new hands and kept its old habits. Fair scales, good paper, a bell that assumed the best. The primer hung where it always had, open to the camellia that had outlasted fashions and winters, and the certainty of men who believed only ledgers mattered. Customers asked after the flower. Grace answered as she'd been taught. "Some things can be shown," she would say, and smile as if the sentence might carry other meanings if handled with care. Years later, when the cemetery was moved to accommodate the city's newer notion of order, Markers wandered from their dead as if the past had loosened its grip. The record of where Elizabeth lay slipped into the kind of municipal ambiguity that makes archivists sigh. The unmarked stone with 2 dates went wherever unmarked stones go. When institutions tell themselves they are doing the practical thing, even so, nothing essential was lost. What needed keeping had already been kept. In the names written by choice, in the work done on clean counters, in the way a door opened and a bell chimed, and a woman behind that counter met a stranger's eyes without dropping hers. Now and then, a man who collected fragments would come across a line in a ledger or a diary and think he'd found the center of a story that refused to center itself. A clerk's copied sentences here, an unsigned letter there, a note about a Montreal license that omitted the part scholars wanted to read. They pieced and argued and published. Grace let them. She had a business to keep and a life to live, and besides, the truest account had already been balanced in the only books that mattered. A widow's courage, a man's chosen name, a child's untroubled answer to who she was. On an April afternoon much later, when a thaw made the city wet and forgiving, Grace unlatched the shop window and set the tins in their familiar order. The young couple paused at the glass, the woman's hand resting on her belly the way Elizabeth's had once rested. "Importer," the man read aloud, pleased with the sound of it. The bell welcomed them inside. Grace measured tea, wrapped it in paper that held its shape, and rang the drawer shut with the soft authority of someone who understands both sides of an account. After they left, she wiped the counter, turned to the framed primer, and checked the camellia as if it might have shifted in its sleep. It hadn't. It never did. She smiled and blew out the lamp one clean breath, the room accepting darkness the way honest work accepts night. Outside, the street held its ordinary noises. Inside, the rules kept keeping. The ledger rested, and the house, no longer a hiding place, simply a home, stood exactly as it should. Archives prefer conclusions that sign their names, but some lives finish in the gentler grammar of continuance. Years unscrolled. Ledgers changed hands. Streets shifted their letters to suit new maps. The Bennett shop kept its bell, its fair scale, and its habit of answering only the questions asked. The primer with the pressed camellia held its pale courage through winters that forgot Georgia, and summers that remembered it exactly. Scholars came and went the way weather does, arriving with convictions, departing with footnotes. One copied 4 sentences from an old clerk's notebook and built an article upon them, careful as a mason, and just as sure his wall would stand. Another followed receipts through Quaker ledgers and discovered only what careful people had meant him to discover: that money travels best when it moves like water, finding the quietest channels. A third wrote a book whose index promised more than its chapters could give. They all found the edge of a story and mistook it for the center. That is not a failure. Edges are where most of us live. In Savannah, the house that had once practiced silence finally yielded to lumber and light. Children learned their spelling in rooms where slates had been hidden for a different kind of lesson. Somewhere beneath a floor that no longer existed, a board remembered a woman's palm, pressing it flat to keep secrets from becoming smoke. The city, which had always been skilled at forgetting, allowed itself a rumor on April nights, a window lit, a voice in a library that wasn't there anymore, a scrap of Byron curling in air that smelled of jasmine and rain. Tour guides gave the dreams to visitors. Reality asked for less and gave more. North in Montreal, St. Henry grew into streets that misremembered their own names and still managed to carry people home. The directory pages browned and flaked, but a line survived long enough to matter: Bennett, Grace, importer. No husband appended, no apology implied, a thin stroke of ink across a century that had tried to teach different lessons. What became of descendants is best answered the way Elizabeth would have answered, plainly, and only what is certain. Faces with a habit of steadiness, a preference for work that balances by evening, an instinct for doors that open when knocked properly, and for the kindness of asking only what a stranger can afford to tell. Somewhere, a child learned to say a flower's name in 2 languages and was not corrected when she called it home. Somewhere, a woman closed a ledger and felt a key turn in the room without any lock at all. If you wanted proofs, you could collect them. a Montreal notice from 1869 that names a widow's strength and her belief that souls answer to God before they answer to men. A church register that records a girl called Grace who listened well. A merchant's card, its edges softened by pockets, that insists upon a man's chosen name. Importer, not property. If you needed more, you could find less. A stone that went missing when a cemetery moved. A lawyer's pouch whose leather outlived its letters. An empty study that once contained the whole arithmetic of a life. But proof was never the point. The point was choosing. In 1839, Elizabeth Montgomery Thornton and James Bennett refused the sum that society set for them and wrote a different total at the bottom of the page. They did it with paper and prayer, with schedules and silence, with a shotgun on a porch and a pressed flower between glass. They did it with a vow said, where vows were not supposed to be spoken, and a journey taken by roads that were not supposed to exist. They did it finally by living long enough for the words, of course, to be said about them by a stranger who meant it. If there is a last scene, let it be ordinary. The shop late, the lamp trimmed low, the street outside practicing dusk. Grace, the younger, now older, counts the day's small coins and writes a clean number in a column that has always told only the truth. She pauses, listens for the bell the way she was taught, hears nothing but evening, and smiles. On the wall, the camellia keeps its pale defiance. She checks it, habit, not fear, and then turns the sign, lifts the latch, and steps into the air that belongs to everyone. History will list wars and laws and men with signatures. It will make room, now and then, for the precise courage of a widow who taught a boy to read in a room not meant for learning, and later stood on a porch where light met night and chose not to move. It will make room for the boy who became a man and wrote his name until the letters learned him back. It will not always say their names together. That is all right. Together was their business, not history's. Once, a researcher wrote that the most unsettling thing about the Thornton-Bennett affair was how many others must have happened and left no mark at all. Perhaps. Or perhaps the mark is simply this: a set of rules kept in a drawer, a child named for the woman who held the key, a ledger that balances because someone decided it should. Perhaps the mark is a pressed flower that survived the miles between a forbidden garden and a lawful counter, its petals insisting that fragility is not the opposite of strength. Close the book, then, not because the story ends, but because it has entered the part where books are poor tools. Outside, April leans against a window. Somewhere south, moss makes lace of branches. Somewhere north, a river behaves like a road. And somewhere in between, as always, people choose, quietly, exactly, against the arithmetic of their times and toward a life that fits the measure of their hearts.